Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to this morning's class. My name is Ann Hall. I'm a staff member of the Woodlands Township's Environmental Services Department. And today we are offering our fall home landscape gardening class. The title today is Fall Foodscaping Texas Style. And we're delighted to have you with us this morning. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what the Environmental Services Department has to offer this fall. We have some upcoming programs and events that can be found online at the Woodlands Township's website. And the website is in the chat feature. And we mentioned earlier that the chat will be emailed to everyone after the presentation. Some of the things that we have coming up this fall are a class on November 7th, Rainscaping for Landscape Irrigation. And then on Thursday, November 12th, we'll have the second Fall Walk in the Woods Nature Lecture, which is going to feature Friends of Texas Wildlife with Kathy Couder. We still have space available in both of those classes, and you do need to register. Coming up on Saturday, November 14th, is our next community event, which is the 3R Recycling Drive-Through. This is an annual event that has a new format this year to provide safety for everyone in the current COVID situation. We'll collect recyclables from vehicles as people drive through, and then all of those things will be taken to the recyclers. This is going to be a wonderful event, and we look forward to your participation. I'd like to introduce our presenter for today. This is Brie Arthur. She lives in North Carolina, where she implements foodscaping in her own landscape. She studied landscape design and horticulture at Purdue University. She spent more than 10 years working in the field of plant production with leading nurseries. She's one of the national leaders of the Foodscape movement. She is a correspondent on the PBS television show, Growing a Greener World. She serves as the Garden Writers Association National Director of Region 4 in the Southeast United States. Founding member of Emergent, a group for growing professionals. She also serves as on the executive committee for the International Plant Propagation Society's Southern Region and on the board of directors for the North Carolina Botanical Garden Foundation. Today's agenda will be a little bit different than the agenda you received by email. Rather than one 10-minute break, we'll have two separate 5-minute breaks. Brie will guide you through the agenda, and you may submit your questions using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Brie will respond to your questions throughout the presentation, and she will also have a question and answer time at the end. It's my honor now to present Brie Arthur, who will share her foodscaping experience and expertise with all of us.
Well, thank you for that. It's always funny to hear a bio. Basically, I'm just a not very well-adjusted plant nerd who's really excited that other people want to learn about gardening and spend their free time the same way I do. And I really appreciate all of you joining and being a part of this. And I've been admitting people just to let you know, and as they join through the waiting room. But I do have the chat up. Now I'm going to confess to you guys, I have multiple screens, and sometimes I look to the left, and that's because that's where the chat is instead of looking at you. And I know that's really annoying. It's one of the problems, I think, with Zoom is that the place that the speaker is supposed to look is really small and it doesn't feel natural at all. But I'm going to try my best to keep making eye contact with all of you, because that's what I would do if we were live in person. And though I wish we were live and in person, I am really glad that we can get together this way, though I love coming to Texas. And I've had 3 trips to Texas canceled this year, just for 2020, which I was actually supposed to be in Texas right now. So we would have been doing this live and in person if the pandemic hadn't hit. But I do hope I'll be able to come in the future and visit you all and, get to know your climate a little better. I'm always a little apprehensive about giving super specific advice, especially planting time information for a zone that I've never gardened in. So I am giving you the best information I can based off of extension services that I researched on your behalf, and also from going through past trips that I've taken to your area. And I recognize that Texas is like a continent in and of itself. So, Houston is very different from Nacogdoches, which is very different from Dallas or Austin or San Antonio. Those are the primary areas that I've spent time in Texas in, with specific regard to speaking about foodscaping. So I try not to take too much information from those other places because I know that it's not really literal for where you are. And I'm going to stop doing this because we have a huge presentation to get through and I need to get on it. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in. And my name is Brie, like the cheese, Arthur, like the golden girl. I have really been gardening since I was a small child. My grandparents and parents both garden, but I grew up in 4-H and we weren't farmers. So my way of participating was growing backyard vegetables and cut flowers to enter into the fair. And that was really how I got to know that horticulture was something I could study in college and have a career in. It's all because of the hardworking extension agents. So I'm so grateful for the Master Gardening Program and for 4-H and really just all that our agricultural extension provides as far as being an educational resource at no cost. It's all funded through tax dollars. So I always say hug an extension agent when it's safe. Otherwise thank them virtually for all that they do for educating the public. I did not professionally study like agriculture. I studied landscape design, and I really specialized in the production of plants. I worked in floriculture, growing annuals at a large greenhouse, then moved into perennial production, and finally landed in tree and shrubs. So my specialty really is ornamentals. And I started growing vegetables for myself out of desperation. I had bought a house in the subprime mortgage market back in 2006 and just simply wasn't earning enough money through my full-time job working as a plant propagator to be able to pay my mortgage, my student loans, my car payment, my energy bills. Just life in general is expensive. And if you're not aware of it, horticulture isn't necessarily a field that you become rich quick in, but it's certainly a passion-driven industry, and that's why I'm a part of it. But I started growing vegetables just because I didn't have enough money to go to the grocery store. So it was really, very practical why I dove into this. And I was living in a neighborhood with an HOA that was really keen to give out fines for absolutely everything. And I was really nervous about growing food because I didn't have money to shop. I certainly didn't have money to pay my HOA. And it was a really incredible experience as I started incorporating food in my landscape rather than, growing it in the traditional way of having a segregated plot or a raised bed. I was literally hiding things like broccoli and cauliflower underneath encore azaleas and knockout roses. And I ended up winning Yard of the Year, which came with a gift certificate to a grocery store, which was really, really helpful. But it empowered me. That experience really showed me that a lot of homeowner associations, people are afraid to grow vegetables because we have some regulations. We have architectural review boards and we have standards for our landscape. But in my case, you know, when I started growing vegetables in a way that wasn't sort of the normal way, where you kind of pretend you're a farmer and you grow in straight lines and you invest in a lot of lumber, but rather growing them more the way you would any other ornamental plant, my HOA responded really positively. And it's led me now to basically change my career entirely to help guide people into understanding their homeowner association rules to begin with and getting people to literally think outside of the box when it comes to how you grow your vegetables. So that's really kind of the base of where we're coming from with today's talk. And this is going to be our schedule. So this is our first half. We're going to get through the kind of the basics of what foodscaping is and how you design it. We're going to go through some kind of technical information and dealing with insects, soil improvement, weed control, how you can save seeds for yourself. And then we're going to do a little tour of my home garden as it looks right now. And we're going to take a 5-minute break. I've actually planned 3 5-minute breaks because I have a lot in here and I want you to be comfortable and go to the bathroom and get beverages as you need. Our second half is going to really be about talking about all the plants. And I've actually incorporated a lot more than just planting for fall. So I hope that I'm actually going to give you information that's relevant year round, or at least almost year round. Your summers are like being on the surface of the sun. And maybe I'm going to just recommend that you enjoy the air conditioning during the really hottest part of your season, and then get excited about gardening when it cools down a bit and is more pleasant. And then finally, in between the plants, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to jump into some creative strategies for managing animals. Now, I was really happy to learn that in the Woodlands, you have fenced backyards to help keep some of the animals away, but your front yards are open. So hopefully you'll find some of that info helpful. I don't have solutions for hogs, okay? I'm just gonna put that out there. And I want you in Texas to keep your hogs. I don't want them in North Carolina. We have your armadillos, okay? And I don't appreciate it. Armadillos are a nightmare. But yeah, I have better ideas for deer and rabbits and groundhogs and squirrels and chipmunks. Animals that are a little less ornery than your boars that you have throughout your state. Now I'm going to use both of my books as reference guides for everything that we're covering today. And you can find both of those on my website, briegrows.com, or you can find them on Amazon. I'm actually dangerously low on the Foodscape Revolution right now, and it's getting reprinted in Canada, but because of the pandemic, everything's taking longer. So I actually won't have copies of that until December, but I do have plenty of Gardening with Greens. So what is a foodscape? Well, it's not a new idea. It actually is centuries and centuries old. It's really only been in the last 30 years that we've had the privilege of having our landscapes devoted only to ornamentation. And that's thanks to the hardworking farmers who make food distribution possible and inexpensive and so accessible to all of us. So my simple definition is just a landscape that produces both food and flowers. It's not one or the other, it's both, it's everything. It's all the plants that you love to grow. I am a full believer that all plants provide a purpose, but right plant, right place, because let's face it, we all know there's a bunch of invasive plants, both ornamental and in exotic, and even in some cases, some of our native plants can behave in a somewhat invasive way, depending on your management strategies. So it's really about choosing the best plants. The technical definition is just the integration of edibles in a traditional landscape or even in containers. And at the last minute this morning, I decided to add a bunch of information about growing in containers. So you'll have that as a resource as well. And I just firmly believe that every landscape is truly an opportunity. It's really something that we aren't tapping into right now, but it's my hope that in the years to come, people will understand how, every little bit of square footage that you have is is a place that you could grow something that provides beauty and bounty and meaning, you know, whether you are eating it or you're growing that to facilitate, you know, a beneficial insect. In the case of grains, you may be growing grains to help feed your native bird population. But you know, there's so many different aspects of what motivates us to garden. And the more people see you in your neighborhood doing something creative, the more permission they'll feel to do the same and actually indulge in gardening in a way that maybe they've never thought of before. And maybe the one silver lining of 2020's pandemic is the, you know, extraordinary interest that people have now taken in getting outside and gardening. And I hope that that is something that's actually going to stick. And it's always my goal to give quality information and be a resource for people, so that, you know, they don't have to do it the hard way. They can learn from my failures instead of doing it the wrong way themselves. I'm really great at doing things wrong. So you'll see I'm going to share a lot of information about what not to do. And everything that I'm going to share with you today was first inspired by Rosalind Creasy. She wrote the Bible of edible landscaping and has 23 books on this subject. So if you're not familiar with the work of Roz Creasy, please Google her. And I would highly suggest investing in some of her books as well. She gardens on the West Coast, just outside of San Francisco. So, you know, there's great information that, you know, you can kind of take from both of us being on opposite sides of the country and having very different environments. This is Roz's front yard. And whenever I'm dealing with an ornery HOA, I usually start with these pictures and I kind of ask them like, can you tell me what is offensive here? And, you know, let's start really dissecting what the goals of your architectural review board are. And, you know, let's distinguish, you know, what is the standard that you want to set for the people living in this neighborhood? And generally, when they see these pictures, they're like, no, that's beautiful. You see there's structure, there's ornamentals, there's evergreens, there's shrubs, there's trees, there's perennials, there's annual flowers, and there's vegetables, all incorporated. There's really no distinct zone from one another. And generally they say, but this isn't how people vegetable garden. And they're right. And that's why people like me are preaching this message of foodscaping, because this is productive but beautiful. And it's actually easier to maintain rather than a segregated vegetable garden. So a few other great examples of foodscaping include the wonderful garden Chanticleer, which is just outside of Philadelphia. And as a result of the pandemic, they were closed for quite a long time this spring and summer. They and about 50 other gardens in the Philadelphia region joined forces with Pennsylvania Horticulture Society, PHS, which is the organization that runs the Philly Flower Show. And they started this program called Harvest 2020. And all of these large public gardens incorporated food into their ornamental spaces, into their containers. And then each week they harvest everything and it gets donated and distributed to communities with food insecurity needs. And I just think this program is so meaningful. It's really transformed kind of the purpose that these gardens serve, in that they're not just there to facilitate beauty, but they're also doing something that's really important for their communities. Another great example of foodscaping is at Epcot. And, you know, I understand Epcot has an endless budget. So it's kind of a difficult place to say, okay, I'm going to do what Disney does, right, in your yard. However, I think it's a great example of what a public garden or a public park can actually provide. So they are incorporating food crops through all of their landscape beds at Epcot. And it's not just for the sake of it being cool or being recognizable. They're harvesting these crops and they're being used in all of the restaurants throughout the Disney parks. So this is, again, a really meaningful way to use the square footage. And, it's possible. That's the point. A lot of times people think it's just too much to take on, or there's too much liability. And now we have examples not only of home gardeners doing this, but large public places that are successfully cultivating food crops right there where people walk, and they're doing it in a really kind of spectacular way. So some of the Foodscape design basics, I always recommend starting with a design that is drawn to scale. Whether you do that or you hire a landscape professional, having a scaled drawing is your base map, and it gives you all the information you need, how much square footage you have, how many plants will fit in, how much mulch, how much compost is going to be required. And it's just something that it doesn't have to be permanent. I drew my landscape 10 years ago when I moved to this house, and we decided that we were going to install this garden. And it's not that the beds don't change, it's that it's my base map. It shows me the square footage of the beds that I have. And if I decide that I want to change those, I make that note on the drawing. And it's something that I refer to with great regularity. So I highly recommend it. It's also generally required. If you're going to make a big change in your neighborhood, you're going to have to submit the plan so that your HOA can review it and understand what your intentions are. And so it serves multiple purposes. Another really important part of foodscaping is that you have ornamental plants, trees, shrubs, and perennials that add structure. We're going to cover some of the perennial food crops, things like that are trees and shrubs and perennial plants that come back year after year. However, most of the food that people grow are annual vegetables, and they don't provide year-round structure. Vegetables don't look good year-round. So it's really important that you not forget the aesthetic. This is why when you move into a neighborhood, you have a certain expectation of what your landscape will look like. Okay, I see a question about recommendation for planning, for drawing software or tools. So I am really old school. I still draw with a pencil and a drafting ruler because that's how I learned how to do it. I went to college 20 years ago and we weren't actually using computers yet. However, I have a friend who does all of his drawings on the iPad Pro, and they have all of that information. Like, you can draw to scale, you just choose your scale. I usually draw everything 1 foot equals, or 1 inch equals 10 feet. I find the 1:10 ratio to be pretty easy to discern from your eye. And you don't have to have too large of a drawing to be able to get your entire property plan on it. But my recommendation would be to check out the iPad Pro and some of their drawing software. You actually physically draw right on the screen. I don't do it that way. I actually print off a plot plan. That's the thing you get when you close on your house. That sort of shows where your property borders are, where your house is. Everything is drawn to scale on that. And then from there, I just convert that to a 1:10 by doing it by hand. I'm sure if you Google, there's probably much better recommendations than what I have. I try to stay off the computer as much as possible. So another important thing that I'm gonna probably reiterate more times than you want to hear, but foodscaping is not about tearing out all your grass. It's really not about tearing out your grass. I like turf. I think turf is really important. I think we could probably evaluate our turf to landscape ratios. In most cases across the country, we have 80% turf, 20% landscape. And I just kind of imagine if we shifted that to 70% turf, 30% landscape, how much more available square footage we could use for pollinator habitat and, more flowers, more vegetable production. So I think sometimes that's the discussion you have with your homeowner association. Um, we're going to talk a bit about crop rotations and the advantages that foodscapes offer because you are growing on more square footage. And also we're going to cover things like how to do cover cropping and green mulch applications to naturally improve your soil. Focusing on diversity is really, really important. And then devoting a proper budget to, compost, so to soil improvement. That is the ongoing challenge for all the gardeners in the South and especially through Texas. The ground doesn't freeze, you get a lot of rain, a lot of your organic matter just flushes right down, into the Gulf of Mexico in your case. So compost is constantly something that's going to have to be addressed. I'm going to cover a lot about exposure, so I'm not going to get into what sunny means yet, because I have slides devoted to that. And anything about 15 to 30% turf. I think that is going to be up to your capacity to manage that much square footage devoted to landscape space. And I would be cautious about getting too ambitious. I currently have an acre property. A half an acre is a native woodland swamp. And then a quarter acre is turf, a quarter acre is landscape space. And there is no way that I could expand my beds and reasonably manage them to make them look decent year round. So I'm like at my maximum capacity for maintenance. So I think that's the main consideration. I always recommend starting out small. You can always expand, but you don't want to get too big and either lose interest or have your lifestyle change. And then all of a sudden it goes to pot and all of your neighbors get really aggravated with you. So I recommend doing phases so that you get accustomed to the maintenance, the long-term maintenance of this approach, and you build your confidence and you understand, the practicality, because at the end of the day, nothing is easier than mowing a lawn. It might not be the most ecologically sound choice, but from a simple perspective, lawn maintenance is still the easiest. And yeah, longleaf pines. I mean, I love a savanna look. You're not going to grow a lot of food crops if you have too much woodland coverage. So you also need to be, conscientious of all of that. Turf does have a purpose. It's a permeable surface that you can walk on, you can drive on, your pets can play on it, your children can play on it. So I am not an anti-turf person, but I do think we could think about our turf ratios. Now, into what you actually grow as far as your food crops. I'm amazed at how many people grow food that they don't eat. And that defeats the purpose. So I usually will tell my design clients, like, write down what you've eaten for a week. And then let's find the 4 or 5 vegetables that recur over and over again, because those are going to be things that you are already used to eating, that you already understand how to cook. So you're not going to have to like reinvent the wheel and figuring out like, what do you do with Swiss chard, which is still amazing to me, but it happens all the time. I want you to be able to use your landscape in a way that makes you feel like you're really making a contribution. And at least from my perspective, the way I feel like I'm making a contribution to the world is to grow a lot of just a handful of things and actually change some of my buying habits at the grocery store. So, I, for example, we eat a lot of tomatoes. We like to eat sauce and we like to eat salsa. We eat garlic and onions every day. It's in every meal that we cook. We have garlic and onions. We eat a lot of peppers or a lot of potatoes. We eat a lot of peppers. And we also use wheat flour. We like to make flour tortillas and, have tacos or burritos or enchiladas or, whatever. And so those are things that when we started looking, what do we eat all the time? These were our top veggies. So this is what I concentrate to grow a lot of, so that I don't actually have to buy these things from the grocery store. And that makes me feel like, okay, my garden is actually doing something that's meaningful, versus growing one of everything and you don't even have enough for a meal. And I see a lot of people do that, and then they get overwhelmed because they don't necessarily know how to manage all those different plants, and they don't know exactly when to harvest, and they don't really know how to cook with all of it. And I find that to be very impractical, and that's not the best use of your time and resources. So back to lawn. I will say, when this comic came out, it got shared to me like 400 times on Facebook. And I was shocked and disappointed that people weren't getting my message, that I'm not telling everybody to disrupt their neighborhood infrastructure by ripping out their lawn and then, God forbid, putting in a bunch of ugly raised beds. And you're going to see why I hate raised beds in a little bit. So, you'll understand. This is not the point of foodscaping. The point of foodscaping is to make it so you can live in harmony in the neighborhood that you chose to live in. And I find that a lot of people get really ornery about rules. And I'm like, well, why did you buy a house in a neighborhood with an HOA if you don't want to abide by the rules? You could move somewhere else. And so this frustrates me a lot, that people think the only way to grow vegetables is equally to not have lawn. Now, I will say, I think we can evaluate how much space we devote to lawn and how we manage lawn. If it's green, it can be mowed. It does not have to be a monoculture. It does not have to be sprayed with synthetic herbicides and fertilizers and pesticides. We could do a much better job from an ecological perspective in how we manage turf spaces. But it's not just about ripping out grass, because the alternatives aren't necessarily easier. So grass actually does have a purpose, believe it or not. It's the third most important source of oxygen on this planet. And it's, I know, absurd, but it's true. An acre of turf produces more oxygen than an acre of rainforest. And we have 40 million acres of turf in the United States, okay? Now, I think we could do better than that. I'm saying we have opportunity. Everything that I'm going to talk to you about today, it's not a challenge, it's an opportunity. Okay, so I want you to think positively about how we can all collectively raise the bar for what our standards are for landscaping and what our expectations are for the land that we manage. So I dove in to some of your covenants. And actually, you have some really easy covenants compared to some of the neighborhoods that I deal with in this area. So consider yourselves very, very fortunate. But if you haven't read your covenants, you should, and you can find them very easily. I just Googled the Woodlands HOA covenants, and I found your entire document. So, like all neighborhoods, there's an expectation that you're going to submit a plan when you're doing major changes. If you're adding a structure, it needs to be permitted. Don't try and sneak a garage in. That's not actually going to help you sell your house in the long run anyhow. There's an expectation for understanding the bed to lawn ratio, but this is not a line in the sand. This is something that when you have a good landscape plan, shows your intention, your HOA review board will have some context to what it is that you're trying to achieve. And that's really why these rules exist. You do not have a no veggies in the front yard mandate, which is really, really important. There are huge neighborhoods in Florida that still have that mandate. And in many cases, people have more sun in the front yard than they do in the backyard. I think in your case, many of you have wooded properties, and, most of the vegetables are going to want more sun than shade. So being able to have those, scattered around different parts of your property where you have sunny patches is really important. You know, the main thing with HOAs, and I will tell you, because at the beginning, I was one of those people that had a bad attitude about my homeowner association. I told you I was afraid of them. And what I realized is they're there to maintain our property values. You know, at the end of the day, we all want to have our house be an investment, right? And if you have a neighbor that makes their yard look crazy, that actually does impact your property value. So the HOA is there to maintain that and provide some standards. So it's important that you garden in a way that doesn't disrupt the infrastructure. But it's possible, it's totally possible to grow tons of food and not disrupt the infrastructure. You just have to think outside of the wooden box. So if we were in person, I hope that you all would be giggling right now, but this isn't pretty. This front yard doesn't look good. This does not inspire me. This is not a design by any measure. Like, clearly a professional designer did not weigh in on this. Look, they don't even have any foundation shrubs. They have nothing. All they have are ugly wooden boxes that will rot. Period. They will rot. They are never permanent. I would be so angry if my neighbors did this. This is absolutely not what I am telling you to do. This is the opposite of what I want you to do. There is zero aesthetic consideration. So I want you to think outside of this, because you don't need lumber to grow food. I'm going to say it again. You don't need lumber to grow food. A friend of mine in Texas, we were recently having a discussion, and we came to the conclusion that the reason people do this is because they won't invest in properly improving their native soil. So this is the easy way out, because you raise it up above grade and you fill it with fake soil, essentially, and then you garden in it for a season or two, and then disease starts setting in because you can't crop rotate. It's not a big enough space. And then you lose interest and the box rots and eventually weeds come in. Just precisely what I'm going to show you here. And these are actually some friends of mine in Houston. So they have this up on Google. I stole it from the internet, but I did let them know. You know, we're going to change the world with these raised beds. Right now, first of all, these raised beds are really small. So that's like enough space for one zucchini in each of these beds. So they're not actually going to grow that much produce in this, right? Now, granted, they've got this massive underutilized backyard that could be growing, you know, hundreds of pounds of produce if they just wouldn't waste their money on lumber. Another problem with this, they're not quite spaced far enough apart to get a lawnmower between them. So that means you actually have to come out with a weed whacker, and nobody likes using a weed whacker. You know, actually, that's not true. As a child, I actually loved the gratification of weed whacking, but as an adult, I don't want to spend my time doing that. So at least if you're going to do this in the privacy of your backyard, have the sensibility to separate them far enough so you can get your lawnmower between them, so that you don't allow weeds to grow up right adjacent to these beds. But this is what happened to their raised beds. Now, would you like that to be your neighbor's front yard? Because I wouldn't. This is like the opposite of why I garden. This is just like, oh my God, what happened? Apparently, you know, they just stopped mowing because they didn't want to anymore. This is not how we're going to change HOA regulations. This is why HOA regulations exist, to be honest. So I've actually never really seen a raised bed vegetable garden that looks good year round. And that's the bottom line. Like, they can look nice for a temporary time. You know, when you do it this way, it's not ergonomic. You're not like not bending over. So if you're gonna make it because you have back problems or something, make them tall enough. And I'd recommend not building them out of lumber, but rather do it out of cinder blocks, or, you know, something that's actually going to be permanent, that will, you know, not just rot away or get termites to come in. Of course, you can't build these with treated lumber, because then there's no point in eating the food that you grow inside of it. So, you know, these are a very temporary installation, that you could invest the money that you spend on lumber into quality compost and actually develop a really beautiful backyard plan that made it so that you had more food growing. And you could also toss in some beautiful ornamental plants that actually bring in beneficial insects that will help, you know, combat problem bugs. So another big challenge that we all have, and I have this, I have like a streak of OCD. I love a straight line. I actually write with a ruler. Um, so I know it isn't well adjusted, but I already told you I'm not a well adjusted person. You don't have to grow in a straight line. You're not a farmer. You're not using a piece of equipment to plant or to harvest. So you don't actually have to plant in a straight line. You can, I still do, but then I also remind myself, like, oh, you can plant in clumps and make that texture of that kale actually look like something that's there intentionally, instead of me just being kind of boring and really not being creative. The most important thing is that you have a well-balanced plant palette. And so I really encourage you to find plants from all of these categories that you enjoy growing, that, you know, benefit your ecosystem, that accommodate the landscape that you have. So understand your sun to shade ratio, understand your watering capacity. Do you have irrigation? Do you not run irrigation? Do you hand water? You know, and so finding the plants that fit into the specific range that you have. And my best recommendation for finding those is to spend time at garden centers, join the Master Gardener program, because you learn so much from that. You know, get to know your extension agent, but like bring them cookies or something, because they're really undervalued in our society. But find the best from all these categories, and don't get too locked into just one of these, because there are plants from all these categories that are really, really important. So food crops lack diversity. And so this is really the main reason why a segregated vegetable plot or a raised bed is a real challenge, because even though you're planting different vegetables in it, most of the time they're only coming from a handful of plant families. And so when we discuss diversity, what we're really looking at is not genus, species, variety, but we're taking a step back and looking at family. So in the case of cool crops, which we're going to cover later, you know, broccoli and Brussels sprouts and cabbage and cauliflower, they're all the same. They're all in the Brassicaceae family, just like potatoes and tomatoes and eggplants and peppers are all solanaceous crops. So when you plant them all together, you've created a monoculture. Monoculture can be 40 square feet. It can be 40,000 acres. A monoculture is a monoculture. What it leads to is problem insects and disease problems. So look at plant families. When you're buying plants, you know, just Google it. What plant family is, you know, Echinacea in? It's in the Asteraceae family. What plant family is, you know, roses? What are roses in? Well, they're in the Rosaceae family. And then really just start counting how many plant families you have represented in your landscape. And then kind of look at a zone, look at the front foundation of your landscape, and try to say, well, do I have 8 different plants? How many plant families are actually incorporated in those 8 different plants that are here planted, you know, near my front door? And then make plant decisions based off of adding more diverse plant families to that. So matching cultural needs. This is so important. And you already do this as gardeners. You're already making decisions. This plant likes more shade than sun, so it goes maybe on the north side of your house, or, you know, into an area where you have taller tree cover. I consider full sun to be 8 hours. I don't think in Texas you need 8 hours of sun to grow any vegetables. I have definitely visited areas in the Houston region, in and around Houston, where they were successfully growing fruiting vegetables in what I classify as part sun, 4 to 6 hours. And in many cases, they were really only getting 4 hours of direct light because they had building shade that came, and blocked their community gardens and things. There is a plant that can grow in all of these. So think about it like this, figure out what way your house is facing. And I'm always amazed at when I go to a client's house and I ask, well, which way does the sun rise? And they don't know. Like, okay, well, let's use your phone and let's figure out which direction you're facing, because that's going to tell you a lot. Eastern exposure tends to be much cooler, much milder compared to Western exposure. Western exposure is bright and hot, and it can burn plants. And like in the case of a tomato, I do better with tomatoes that are on the east side of my house, my front yard, versus tomatoes in my backyard, which is west facing. It's completely counterintuitive for everything that I learned about growing tomatoes, but it's the reality of where I live. And I think that same concept certainly applies to all of you. You are 2 zones warmer than me, and I have been in Houston in the summer, and it's the hottest place I've ever experienced. Second hottest place was San Antonio in August, and it was like 90 degrees at 10 o'clock at night. However, I have a soft spot for heat, so I still like it, and I would still come and visit you in the middle of summer. So directions also going to help you understand microclimates, and everybody has microclimates. You have heat sinks and you have colder areas. Like the north side of my house is where my dryer vent is. So when we get particularly cold in the winter, we suddenly drop temperatures. I run the dryer through the middle of the night to help protect my camellias, because I don't want them to get damaged from a sudden cold spell. So everybody has different microclimates in different parts of your garden. And once you really start paying attention to that, you can then take best advantage of that area. Now, the general rule for growing in sun versus shade, fruits and roots need full sun, but again, in your condition, I would say 4 to 6 hours is going to be sufficient, particularly through the winter season when the sun is lower in the sky and it's not so hot. In deep shade, you can still grow a lot of leafy greens, certainly lettuce and kale and arugula and mustard. They may not grow with the same vigor as they do in full exposure, but you will be able to cultivate them. Planting where it's convenient to water is really important, because, most vegetables need, especially like the common vegetables that home gardeners cultivate, they need supplemental water, even in wet years. They're still going to need, the addition of some irrigation. So I also say that planting your vegetables in a convenient area that you walk past on a daily basis, that's really important, because you have 15 minutes between a zucchini being the right size and it becoming a baseball bat. So, put it somewhere where you actually walk past it on a regular basis. And of course, in the case of zucchini and squash, if you're anything like me, you probably have squash borers where they die from powdery mildew. So set your expectations very low, with the expectation that you may only get 4 to 6 weeks of productivity, and then you're going to rip them out. So my recommendation for squash and zucchini is to do regular seeding. And everybody, this is Sophia Petrillo, named for the Golden Girl, and she's one of my garden helpers, and she likes to Zoom. Now, remember, food crops do need water, and I don't have an irrigation system, so I primarily water by hand using a hose. I remember the day that I told the landscape contractor who was helping install our first phase of this landscape from my drawing. They came with a sod cutter. That's the best thing to do if you're building out new space in a turf area. Remove the sod properly. Don't try and smother it. Don't try and kill it with Roundup, because I promise you it'll keep coming back. Just bite the bullet and get a sod cutter, make your beds proper, and managing them for the long term will be easier. But anyhow, I told this landscaper when he asked about running irrigation, and I was like, no, I like dragging hoses, which will probably go down as one of the stupidest things I've ever said in my life, because I could have had water, even not irrigating through the entire beds, but I could have had water spigots run to all different sections of my garden, making the irrigation task by hand significantly easier. But instead, I literally will drag 4 or 5 hoses connected to reach some of the areas of my landscape. That was not wise. Don't do that. If you're building a new garden, whether you want an irrigation system that runs through your beds or not, I highly recommend that you have water access points that aren't just attached to your house. That is something that I really regret. And if we ever move, I will make sure that I don't make that mistake again. Now, irrigation in general, here are some of my rules. Drip irrigation is really great for trees and shrubs, but it's not really ideal for annual edibles. I don't think soaker hoses are worth the effort. You have to run them for so long because the pressure is so low. It just doesn't make sense to me. The years where I used soaker hoses, my water bill was outrageously high. And I always recommend the more time and money and energy you spend on soil improvement, the less you're going to need to irrigate. So think about it like this, every dollar you spend in soil improvement is a dollar you won't spend on paying for your city water. Either way, you're spending money, but gardening is a hobby and hobbies cost money. I would rather spend it on soil than spending it on water that's been, treated with chloramine and chlorine and things that don't really benefit my plants. Now, for my favorite sprinklers, and so obviously these are the things that I use. I really love these dram sprinklers, and they're not that expensive, and they last for a really long time. The quality of dram, it can't be compared to like the crappy plastic stuff that you find at Lowe's and Home Depot. So it's worth spending a tiny bit more money for better sprinklers if your management strategy is to water this way. But success always starts with living soil rich in organic matter, and I can't stress this enough. So the main thing that I want you to be aware of is when you're buying animal-based composts, you really do have to ask some questions. First of all, how long has it been aged? Because if it's fresh, it's actually still going to be breaking down. It's going to rob nitrogen. Everything that you plant is going to look yellow. Also, what animal is the compost derived from? A question that your compost supplier probably won't be able to answer. What did that animal eat? But this is the important part. Much of the grains, many of the grains that are grown for animal feed, for efficiency in harvesting, are treated with a persistent herbicide so that they dry quickly and can be harvested. And that totally makes sense. The problem is that these persistent herbicides don't go away in the animal's digestive system. So particularly in the case of horse manure tends to have more issues with killer compost than cow manure. However, it has been appearing in both. That compost has activated herbicide, and it can remain active for up to 7 years. Once you apply it in your landscape, the plants react as if they've been sprayed with herbicide. So most of the time people buy this killer compost and then they blame their lawn service or their neighbor's lawn service, saying that they got oversprayed with Roundup. And that's actually not the case. Very few, at least the landscapers that I have had interaction with, very few are spraying Roundup to the point where it's drifting everywhere, because they know they're going to be responsible for replacing plants that they kill. So it's actually in the compost. Once you have it, you have it. It's very difficult to get rid of. So these are questions you have to ask. And when you find a reliable source for compost, stick with it, and do soil tests on a regular basis. And if you have any plants that start to look like they've been treated with herbicide, meaning like their leaves look like shriveled or curled, or just look funny, or they look yellow, send in a materials sample to Texas A&M, mail it into them, and they'll be able to do a trace test to tell you whether you have killer compost or not. The soil test will not give you information on active herbicides. What a soil test is going to give you is information on your pH level and which nutrients you have available and which nutrients you're deficient in. So that's going to give you a guide for understanding how to fertilize. And that takes me to fertilization. For healthy soil to remain biologically active, meaning having teeming with microbes, essentially, you have to focus on organic fertilizers, because synthetic fertilizers are salt-based, and that sodium is actually going to suppress the microbial activity. So I use things like cottonseed meal. That's a product that's readily available here in North Carolina because we grow cotton. I know I've seen cotton in Texas, so you likely have it as well. I love the Espoma brand of fertilizer: plant tone, holly tone, tomato tone, garden tone. There's a tone for everything. That is just an easy, inexpensive fertilizer. You're never going to over apply it, so you don't have to worry. You're never going to have major issues when you use that. Some liquid fertilizer options include fish emulsion. Everybody in the neighborhood will know you fertilized, so you'll get that level of satisfaction because it's super smelly. But then a not smelly but organic liquid option that attaches right to your hose, just like Miracle-Gro, except this isn't going to suppress the microorganisms like Miracle-Gro does, is this Good Dirt plant food, and you can find that at Target. This is a really, really great, easy to apply, inexpensive organic fertilizer. So check out Good Dirt. Now, here's a little bit more about what synthetic chemistries do in their context of the soil food web, which is a content or an idea that's not new, but it's getting a lot more attention now, particularly from commercial farmers, because they're realizing they could increase their yields by getting off of the synthetic fertilizers and just focusing more on proper cover crops, incorporating different legumes for building nitrogen into the soil and allowing microbes to actually do the work for them to create a stronger root zone, to create a stronger plant, which will ultimately allow the plant to have better pest resistance and better nutrient uptake. So this is why it's so important to focus on organic. And no, I don't like anything that Miracle-Gro creates, period. Their Miracle-Gro topsoil has synthetic fertilizer embedded in it. So you automatically are going to have sodium levels. If you've ever used Miracle-Gro in a container and then you see a white ring around the pot, that's the salt. That's the thing that bonds the synthetic chemistries together. And so I say get off Miracle-Gro 100%. There are better products that are less expensive, that you can start utilizing, you know, and you have it down, you can't, there's no point in taking it out. But what I would recommend is start top dressing with a real compost, something that doesn't have embedded fertilizer included, because you don't need that. You know, a lot of times people will top dress through the winter. Your plants aren't even actively absorbing that fertilizer, so it's basically just wasted. And every time it rains, that fertilizer is going to run down into your water systems. So I think you're better to not use any soils that have fertilizer included. Add fertilizer yourself according to the label, but something like plant tone, I just do like a handful of plant tone on every shrub, the beginning of April and the beginning of October. And that's enough fertilizer for the season. All my plants do really well. So will they harm 6-year-old trees and shrubs? They may not necessarily harm it, but what it is doing is not allowing the roots of those plants to actively engage in nutrient uptake. So that's the huge disadvantage of these synthetics that for the last 70 years, this has been the standard. And we know now it's just not the most efficient. It's great for the petroleum industry, and that is why it exists. It's a huge aspect of the byproduct of the petroleum industry. So it's not that it doesn't have a purpose. It's just that, particularly as a home gardener, this is not, using synthetics is not going to be your lowest maintenance, most inexpensive, most effective route. You're much better to focus on, you know, creating a healthy soil base, and then you'll have stronger plants that will live longer. Yes, take the fallen leaves. My recommendation with leaves is to shred them with a lawnmower, because they'll break down faster if they're shredded, and then use that as mulch. Leaves are black gold. I will never understand why people rake them to the street and have the city take them, or worse, they burn them. Why would you burn the greatest gift that God has ever given us? That does not make any sense whatsoever. So keep your leaves. I always say it's literally in their name. Leave the leaves. Or give them to me. We actually got a lawnmower with a bagger just so we could steal the leaves from our neighbors. So there you have it. Okay. So what you just keep the leaves as is. You can put whole leaves in the bed. Just expect that they won't break down as quickly. You know, and sometimes they look a little unkept. So often what I will do with leaves, I will put them down in my beds, and then I'll just do a light layer of mulch. And, you know, mulch of your choice. I use triple shred hardwood because it's inexpensive and it's easy to put out. But I'll just do a light layer, like a half an inch. I'm painting with mulch just to give the illusion of neat and tidy. And that satisfies everyone's need for my landscape to look clean. But meanwhile, I have the benefit of those leaves insulating plants and breaking down, adding organic matter. Okay, so what about insects? Well, you're not going to not have them, so you might as well face that reality. Right now, cabbage worms are a huge issue, and there's a couple species of cabbage worms to be on the lookout for. This is the green one, and it's really hard to see, and they eat everything. And they're cabbage whites, like the little butterflies. They just float around and they lay eggs all day long. That's all they do. And if someone wants to call them a pollinator, I will fight you to the end about it, because they're not a pollinator, they're a pest, and there is a difference. Another huge pest through the cool season is the cross-striped cabbage worm. And this one actually lays its eggs in large batches. So like the green one, you might have 3 or 4 on a plant, and like within 24 hours, they can eat every leaf. But with this one, you'll have like 25 on a plant, and they eat the whole plant in like 6 hours. So it's a thing. It's a thing to be aware of. They are not impossible to deal with, though. We've got Bacillus thuringiensis to just apply. You can apply, this is the powder form. You can also apply liquid BT, and this is a soil dwelling bacterium. It's basically one of the only like organic, safe ways to treat insects. One of the few, one of the most practical, I think, specifically for caterpillars. So BT only works on caterpillars, and don't put this on milkweed or plants that like beneficial caterpillars eat, things that caterpillars that turn into butterflies, but focus this on your food crops where pests tend to congregate. Um, Now, a couple other options you have for insects, particularly staying away from registered pesticides, staying more on the organic side. Copper sulfate is good for fungal issues and will actually kill some weeds. Um, Generally, if you have a fungal issue, I would first contact your extension agent to confirm what's actually going on. Of course, horticultural oils are wonderful, but they're only good when the temperatures are below 80. So you cannot apply these through the warm season. It will actually coat the plant to the point where it can't respire, which is like us sweating. So you only do this during kind of the cool season or the dormancy season. Often horticultural oil is sold as dormant oil, and you apply this to plants like broadleaf evergreens like camellias or citrus that get a lot of scale issues, which scale is a tiny little white insect that typically is on the back side of a leaf. If it's a big infestation, it might be on the stalks of the plant. You just spray the horticultural oil onto the surface of the scale and it smothers them, and then it kills them that way. You can use like a product like Rototony. It's an insecticide that you would use with other organic pesticides. So I would say you kind of mix that with your horticultural oil, and then you would get, things like aphids under control, mealybugs under control, scale. Those tend to be the top three, especially on permanent plantings. Certainly cabbage worms with the BT, and then things like squash bugs and stuff. I don't have a solution. My solution for those kinds of summer active insects is to basically seed those plants every 5 or 10 days so that you constantly have a new crop coming. So when the squash borers come in, you can let them have a handful of plants, and that keeps them off of your new plants. A lot of times people will say hand removal. I don't always think that that is a reasonable solution. I think we probably all have something better to do with that. Does sesame oil mix also need to be used when it's cooler? Yes. So basically all the oils are basically going to prevent the plant from respiring, which is, it's exchange of water through its cells. So you want to concentrate that when the temperatures are cooler, because when it's hot out and the plant can't respire, it will die. That tissue will actually burn off, and then it doesn't photosynthesize. I often recommend, if you see a problem insect start to come up, what about a black fungus-like covering on plants? So, okay, sometimes that black fungus is actually coming from your mulch, and that can very easily be treated with copper sulfate. And I think like even Lowe's and Home Depot carry copper sulfate now, but certainly like a good garden center. I know like I often will come and give talks at Enchanted Gardens, and they have a great organic pest control area at Enchanted. But yeah, you just basically mix copper sulfate into a sprayer, and then you just apply it, and it'll make it disappear usually within a few hours. It's really efficient. Now letting bugs eat bugs. This is why I don't recommend broad spectrum pesticides, and in particular, like those mosquito sprays. That I know it's nice to not have mosquitoes, because Lord knows I live in a swamp. You know, there's a billion mosquitoes. Even now, there's probably more mosquitoes now than there were 2 months ago. But what we do here, at least, we treat ourselves with off deep woods. I believe very strongly in DEET. I have a food allergy as a result of a tick bite from the Lone Star tick, the alpha gal, where I can't eat any mammalian protein. And I just decided that I don't walk outside of my house without DEET on at this point. And because of that habit, I'm not as offended by the rest of the bugs that live in my yard. Now, I know Houston, you guys are really buggy. Okay, I know that. So I understand when people have those broad spectrum pesticides applied, because it may be the only way that you can enjoy being outside, but it will impact all the bugs, the good bugs and the bad bugs. There's no spray for mosquitoes that kills only mosquitoes. And the fact that that mosquito spray is derived from chrysanthemums doesn't mean that it still doesn't kill all the good bugs. Like, that is completely irrelevant. So if you can treat yourself for the bugs and tolerate going outside, you will find things like this happening, where I have an aphid infestation, but then the lady beetles come. The lady beetle larva is the stage that actually eats the beetle or eats the aphids. And it's just a really incredible thing to see how efficient nature can be in controlling itself if you allow your landscape to have that kind of balance. Now, in doing all this, you're not going to be able to use pre-emergent herbicides, because a lot of what I'm going to tell you about coming up is going to be direct seeding. If you do use pre-emergent in your lawns, just be aware of maybe applying it by hand along your edges where your landscape beds meet your lawn surface. Otherwise, you're going to potentially have pre-emergent in your beds, and that's going to prevent the good plants from being able to germinate. Some other information on weed control. Hand weeding is always going to be the best bet. Please do not use vinegar in your garden. I wrote it twice so that you really see it. Vinegar is not better than Roundup. It's not. I get that it feels better psychologically, but it's not. It's not safer than Roundup, okay? It's not. If you are determined to use vinegar, keep it in your hardscape spaces. You have cracks in your driveway or, you know, on your patio. But do not spray vinegar in your garden. It will completely mess up your pH, and then you will have a difficult time growing plants everywhere that you sprayed vinegar. A little bit about glyphosate, that's Roundup. You know, it really is a scientific breakthrough. It's sad that Monsanto didn't have a better PR team to explain what Roundup is. It's sad that our society makes decisions based off of emotion and not science. But Roundup really is one of the safest herbicides that homeowners have access to. Another option that you have is glufosinate. So Roundup is glyphosate, and then glufosinate is another contact herbicide, but it doesn't translocate, meaning if you spray it accidentally on something that you didn't mean to spray it on, it's only going to kill the area that you sprayed. It's not going to be absorbed into the rest of the plant's tissue, causing the entire plant to die. So a lot of times, like the brand Roundup, which Scott's bought, will actually have a combo of both glyphosate and glufosinate included. One that kills on contact, one that kills, you know, over a period of 5 to 10 days. And sometimes they even include a pre-emergent in that. Remember, pre-emergent means that it doesn't allow seeds to germinate. A couple of other things, pesticides or herbicides that you may or may not ever come in contact with. I don't recommend any of these as a homeowner. I don't think they're necessary. You you know, if you're trying to kill, like, say, a privet that is, you know, an invasive plant that a bird may have, you know, deposited, you might look at 2,4-D, you know, cutting the stalks down and then painting the stalks with 2,4-D. I don't recommend ever spraying anything like that. But all of these are more expensive than Roundup. So my number one recommendation is hand weed. Get to know what weeds are and then focus on ground plane coverage. Now, a little bit about seed saving. You want to make sure it's dry, and then you want to store it in a plastic container that's waterproof, and you want to refrigerate your seed. Do not freeze your seed. Most seed does not benefit from freezing, especially vegetables that home gardeners are cultivating. Dry, dark, cool, and humid. That's what's going to keep your seed to have a really long duration of viability. And then remember to label it. And I know that seems obvious, but we've probably all done it, where we put, you know, seed in a bag and think that we'll remember, and then we don't. So, you know, just take a minute. You know, I don't know how to get rid of the leaf-footed bugs. I don't know. I have a feeling there's probably a biocontrol insect, and I know Enchanted Gardens actually sells they sell live insects for you to introduce to your landscape to control problem bugs. I have a feeling there's probably like a parasitizing wasp that would get into the life cycle of the leaf-footed bugs, but I would need to do more research on that. I would need to, you know, reference some of your extension entomologists. So I'll make a note. Now, seed sowing. The general rule of thumb, the bigger the seed is, the deeper it needs to go into the ground. And small seeds generally need light to germinate, so they need to be surface sown. So in this case, the top plant there, that's poppies, and then there's wheat, then there's sunflowers, and then there's corn. And each of these has a different depth to be planted in. Is dish detergent good for plants when mixed with water to get rid of flies? I think you're probably better to not use dish detergent, but actually get like insecticidal soap, something that's actually been created for the purpose of going on plants versus something like Dawn. I think you're almost always going to be better off using a product that's labeled for the use of plants versus a home remedy. At least that's been my experience. So yeah, insecticidal soap is another great option that's also very inexpensive for controlling insects. Like you spray it directly on the insects and then they die. Now, some favorite seed sources. Number one, it's called Google. If you are excited about growing a plant and you don't know where to find it, ask Google. 100%. That is better than asking me in an Instagram post where you can find something, because I have no idea. And this year, I really have no idea, because with everybody and their brother gardening, these companies can't keep everything in stock. So I literally have no idea who has what. So Google is your number one source, but here's a list of my favorite seed companies that I buy from on a regular basis. And all of them have wonderful websites, but they also have really, really nice catalogs. So when you buy from them, you automatically get on the list to get their new catalog. And I still like flipping through pages of catalogs. I place my orders online, but I get my inspiration from looking through those seed catalogs. So Baker Creek happens to have like the best catalog that's ever been created. It's like a 400-page encyclopedia of vegetables. It's incredible. Okay, so we're going to take a quick Foodscape tour. I am really terrible on time, but I'm going to try and make up for it. So here is last night. I picked a giant basket of peppers. I'm going to be canning peppers probably tomorrow. That's one of my cats, Ava Grace. And this is our front foundation Foodscape. And you can see how it's mixed with flowers and, foliage elements. And there are tons of vegetables mixed in, but nobody notices the vegetables. And that's the goal. No one can see that there's vegetables planted here. Some of the plants included in here, food crops, are basil, peppers, sweet potatoes, and tomatoes. And again, this is just sort of a close-up of some of the ornamental plants that are included, with like coleus and various salvias. In fact, that red salvia, coccinea, that's a Texas native, zinnia angustifolia. Here is a great Kufia combo with, again, coleus. I really like coleus because they take up a lot of room and they've got so many different colors of foliage. I have a lot of warm season tropicals, things like bananas and ginger lilies and castor beans that I like to incorporate. I have rice growing in pots, and we're going to talk more about rice in a little while, but this is a variety called Black Madres, and it just looks really, really cool in a container with no drainage holes. And moving into our backyard, this is kind of the back patio view, and onto one of my side property borders, and then back through my greenhouse and garage zones. And all of these areas have food and ornamentals mixed together. Like in this picture, you can see, there's some conifers and then an edge of rosemary. That rosemary helps deter some of the problem animals like deer and rabbits. Over on the right side of the greenhouse is a giant hedge of figs with then a giant hedge of blueberries. Here's another close-up of some coleus. This actually surrounds a feed tank that we dip into in the heat of the summer. Instead of having a swimming pool, we just bought a $500 tank from Tractor Supply and hooked it up to a pump and a filter. We vacuum it, we keep it chlorinated, we treat it like a pool. And during the cool season, we just add a water fountain to it so it looks like it's there on purpose. I have Seminole pumpkins literally growing everywhere. And this is my big find of the year. I was commiserating with the Florida Master Gardeners back in May about squash bugs very specifically. And one of the participants said, "Oh my gosh, I've got a squash for you." And it's the Seminole pumpkin, which was actually a native squash that the Seminole Indian tribe in Florida, mid-central Florida, had cultivated for centuries. And this is heat tolerant, disease tolerant, humidity tolerant, and insect free. It's the only squash that I've ever grown where I literally have no problems with it. And I gave you a bunch of resources to my YouTube channel, but last night the neighborhood kids and I did a scavenger hunt looking for pumpkins, and we found a ton. Be prepared if you watch that video. There's a lot of joyful screaming. They were very excited to uncover so many different pumpkins. I have a lot of okra growing still. I really love okra, though I'm a Michigan native. I've been in the South 18 years and I wouldn't want to live without okra. I love these root pouches. So for people who may not have a ton of room to be able to foodscape, but you want to do some container growing, these root pouches or these fabric bags are really inexpensive. These are 100 gallons, so you can plant a lot in them. So these are things I planted in late August. Show you kind of a time progression of how they've grown. Here they are now. The broccolis are starting to head now for me, so I'll be harvesting those probably within the next 3 or 4 weeks. Okay, I'm gonna start a minute early just to answer some of these questions. So the small black beetles that you had on your eggplants are flea beetles, and they're jerks. They're a nightmare. The cover of my book has flea beetle damage on the eggplant leaves. They're difficult to control. It's not impossible. I haven't actually done it. Let me Google flea beetle control. Flea control. So the number one thing that's recommended for flea beetles is putting row covers over your plants which is really hard when you're growing in an ornamental way. So that's not always the most efficient thing. You can do yellow sticky traps, which I know like Lowe's and Home Depot sells those, and that'll capture the adults. There's beneficial nematodes that can be applied to your soil that will destroy them in their larval stage. And you can apply diatomaceous earth for longer lasting protection. So that's actually really probably the best option is buying diatomaceous earth and scattering it around. Flea beetles particularly love eggplants. So you wouldn't have to put diatomaceous earth everywhere, but around your eggplants, that would probably be my best suggestion. Flea beetles are so bad. They're really something. Now, another question about mushrooms. Usually when mushrooms occur like this, it's maybe because of roots rotting, and that's where their mycelium is being fed from. I think the copper sulfate would take them down. However, I would probably recommend, if you're not aware of him, his name is Texas Forager, and I'm putting that in the chat. He knows a lot about mushrooms, a lot more than I do. I had the chance to speak with him last year at the Texas Master Gardener event that was in, I can't remember, but it was a cute little city. I flew into San Antonio and drove there, kind of in between Houston and San Antonio. Anyhow, he is a great resource, and I don't know what his website is offhand. Like, I follow him on Instagram, but he would be able to answer better about mushrooms than me. I usually go to people like him for that stuff. What do you recommend about weeding around plants you want to keep? I often end up having to replant close by plants because they get, yeah. I mean, that's the thing that often happens. Like, if you have like a running grass or like Bermuda grass that like wiry and runs everywhere, a lot of times you will have to dig up everything and then replant the good stuff. There's not a lot there's no easy solution. That's the bottom line. There's no easy solution for weeds. What weeds are great for the garden? So like that's in the eye of the beholder. Like, there's all of this in the spring about like leave your dandelions because they're good for pollinators, and that's true. However, if you have a diverse landscape that has plants blooming 12 months out of the year, you're going to feed pollinators. You don't actually have to have dandelions, see, it's a funny thing. I would say weed is any plant you don't want growing. So it's even hard to identify a weed because what I consider weeds, maybe my neighbors would be happy to have. Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. Okay, controlling ants. I do not have an organic ant solution because like boiling water is going to hurt your plant. So especially if you have a fire ant mound and it's adjacent to a plant, you're better to use Amdro or some sort of like legitimate pesticide to treat the fire ants versus trying one of these organic methods that's going to end up killing your plant. So I'm not technically an organic, like certified organic gardener because I have fire ants and we treat fire ants with proper pesticide. Because I have a nursery license, I have access to Towstar, but as homeowners, Amdro is one brand that comes to mind that's a granular that you treat on site. I think most of the time you have to have a landscape service to put out any sort of pesticides that would just keep them from coming to your garden to begin with. I don't think most of those pesticides aren't going to be labeled for home use. You have to have an applicator's license. Okay, so let's see. Epsom salt for vegetable plants. So this is tricky. In the past, I've used Epsom salts and I've never had any problems with it. And it's like an old, an old wives' tale. There's absolutely zero scientific basis for the use of Epsom salt. Zero. In fact, I know my extension agent basically loses her mind when people start getting into the Epsom salt discussion. She's like, she's a soil scientist. And she's like, you shouldn't apply anything until you know more about your soil. So don't just blindly apply salt, which is precisely the issue with things like Miracle-Gro fertilizer. It's salt. So it's really funny. I've always added Epsom salt to like the holes that I plant tomatoes into, and I've never had any problems as a result of that. It's what my grandparents did. But I can't, as a science-based horticulturalist, I can't give that recommendation because there's literally no data to prove that Epsom salt helps. However, I'm not going to tell you not to use it because I think a little bit it may enable the plant to absorb nutrients in a way that without it, the plants don't absorb as well. But it's hard when there's no evidence that it actually does anything. It's a hard recommendation. Okay, good. I'm glad the Texas mushroom identification. Yes, that's excellent. And I have used a flame weeder and I love it. And that's actually also how I cut down my ornamental grasses. I burn them with the flame weeder. So it's basically like a torch, on a stalk, and you can just go through and burn things. It's really, really quite fun. That's one of the tools that I don't let the neighborhood children use, but I enjoy it a great deal. Don't do it when it's exceptionally dry. You don't want to start a wildfire. Okay, orange oil diluted in water. Ooh, that's good. I've heard about citrus oils for ants and I've never done it. And now I need to, because I've probably got 20 active fire ant mounds outside of my window right now. So thank you for that info. Okay. So we're totally going over time. I'm just going to psychologically prepare you because there's no way I can get through this in 20 minutes. Like I said, you can always watch if you have something else to do today. So let's start getting into what are some of the best plants. And these are not just the best plants for fall. It's going to be much broader than that. But I do want to give you this resource. The All-American Selections is a really, I think, important resource. It's a nonprofit run by the National Gardening Bureau. So if you go to aas.com, you can find annual results for the very best plants from your region. And so, land-grant universities and public gardens do trials that then give this data and they compile it and give it available free through their website. So I know that Dallas Arboretum is one of their big testing sites, and I imagine that there is some place in Houston that does that. So here's a general planting guide. This is not going to be verbatim for you guys because you are hotter longer than I am. But generally, this is cool season concepts. Meaning they like cooler temperatures and shorter days. So this is really like end of October to mid-March is relatively accurate. And then warm season guide, warm season plants like frost-free. You guys are frost-free for the most part. So you actually grow some of these plants at the opposite time of year. So you guys kind of live on Mars compared to the rest of us that live in a more temperate climate. Because I would definitely consider you tropical, if not on the edge of subtropical. It's definitely a climate I'm jealous of and I've always wanted to live in, but like I've confessed, I haven't, so I don't want to give you verbatim. However, these are some Texas-friendly combos that I have seen in action in your area. Um, so tomatoes, peppers, and mustard put together. And you guys have a funny tomato season where you kind of are off for the summer, but you do like a late winter crop into spring and then a late summer into fall crop. And so this is a picture of plants growing in that late winter time where they were, I think, sown or planted around the middle of February, and then growing out and being harvested, late March, April into early May before they die down from your heat. Another combination for this sort of these mild times, this kind of spring fall window that you have: tomatoes, beets, cabbage. That's actually a pepper next to the cabbage, kale. There's actually corn growing behind that. So these are kind of fun combinations. You see how close they are together. The point of this is so that you don't have open space between them. You maximize your square footage, but you're also allowing the diversity of these different plant families from these different food crops to have full advantage. So attracting beneficial insects to kill off the problem bugs. Another good example, fennel. I don't really like eating fennel, but I do enjoy growing it. Sun patience, which I think for you will do really well, really like planted now, and they'll do great until you get very hot in like May, June. And then mustard again. Mustard is a really important plant, whether you eat it or not. It's really good for deterring animals. It's also good as a trap plant for problem bugs. So if you grow mustard, it's actually going to keep some of the bad bugs off of your fruiting plants. So that's a reason enough to grow mustard. Another kind of neat combination that you don't necessarily always think of: corn, sweet potatoes, and radishes all planted together. Essentially, grown again as a ground plane coverage to maximize that square footage. And then this is actually a picture at my house, but I thought it applied to you. Cleome, papaya, rice, and peppers. Again, all planted together, all mixed in one foundation landscape. This for me is a summer planting. I think for your climate, you could do this now. Obviously, papaya might be a little bit sensitive if you have a sudden cold snap. I know I've seen papaya growing in Houston. For me, it's not hardy at all. I have to bring it inside my house. Therefore, I grow it as an annual. There's nothing wrong with that. But all of these plants combined need the same light, the same water, and they all kind of help one another with pest resistance. So let's get into some perennial fruits. Oh, good. Do I start the seeds and then transplant, or do I direct plant the seeds? I direct plant the seeds almost always. And I'm going to show you examples in a little while of the few things that I do in trays and then transplant. But for the most part, I direct seed everything. And how do I manage the larger plants from overwhelming and crowding out the smaller ones? I am a firm believer in survival of the fittest. However, I do have a plan in mind when I put things together to recognize the strength of one plant and pairing it with something that it's compatible with. So I don't put a strong grower and a weak grower together. Generally, weak growing plants, I try to keep towards the edge so they won't get crowded, or I put them in pots because I don't do a lot of maintenance. Until COVID hit, I spent my whole time traveling. I was usually home only 4 days a month. So I was not micromanaging my landscape by any means. Since I've been home since March, I still don't micromanage my landscape. I sit and talk about gardening to my computer almost every single day. So even though I'd love to be out gardening, this week I've done 8 webinars. The garden has not gotten very much attention. So it's also something you'll get with some experience, knowing what grows more vigorously and recognizing to give it more space. But I'm going to go through more of this in a little bit. So some perennial crops that may not totally love you, but maybe do. I've seen pawpaws in Texas, but not specifically in Houston. So I'm not exactly sure. They are, an east to southeastern native plant that grow in the woods. So if you have woodland, this is a good food crop that you could incorporate in shade. And I think it would appreciate the shade because it doesn't want to grow in your heat. The problem with pawpaws, they do attract a lot of varmints. I mean, varmints isn't really the right word. I think that raccoons and possums are great, but I don't necessarily want them on my back deck. They will steal all your pawpaw fruits if you get them to fruit. And pawpaws also form colonies. So expect for them to take up some space, and so that's one of the challenges. The thing with pawpaws, their fruit doesn't have any transportability. So you're absolutely never going to get these at a grocery store. You might every now and again find them at a farmer's market. But for the most part, they're something that you have to have growing yourself. Persimmons, Diospyros, the native persimmon, again, see, I've spent a lot of time in Nacogdoches because one of my really close friends and mentors is Dr. David Creech, and he's an ag professor there. And so he does a lot of testing of food crops. In fact, 40 years of testing the limits for food crops in East Texas. But Nacogdoches and Houston are not the same climate. So again, I haven't seen persimmons in your area specifically, but if you're interested in them, I would encourage you to give it a try. SFA is such a great school. It's usually when I come to Texas, I start in Houston and then I would go out to Peckerwood and do a talk, and then I'd go up to Nacogdoches, and then I'd go over to Houston, and then down to Austin, and then leave out of San Antonio. And I love doing that loop. I irrationally love Texas. Okay, I'm like a huge fan, and I'm really glad to see that you guys are having success with persimmons. Okay, good, because I was worried about adding these couple of fruit trees. So okay, that gives me 2 thumbs up to say grow a couple persimmons. In this picture, this is actually a hybrid variety of the native and the Middle Eastern plant, and this is called Nikita's Gift. And this is just a nice plant because the fruits are bigger and they fruit on low branches, so you can actually eat them. Whereas like the native persimmon often is really tall, might get 60 or 70 foot. And the best fruit are going to be at the very tip. And therefore, generally raccoons and possums get the fruit and you don't. But I grow both. I grow native persimmons and I grow these hybrids. I think there's a place for all of it. Cool thing, persimmons get really nice fall color too. Nice butter yellow. It's a great plant. Figs. I think figs are pretty common for you. They're certainly like a southeastern staple plant. There are a lot of varieties. You can grow a lot more varieties of figs than I can because my figs here actually die to the ground annually. So I have to grow hardy varieties, whereas you can grow cool ones more like LSU purple. And I know that like Texas A&M has put out a bunch of varieties that are great. Oh, I love these comments on the pawpaws. This is great. I'm really glad to know this. So strawberries are a plant that I recommend, whether you grow them as a perennial or you grow them as an annual, it kind of doesn't matter. The variety that I recommend is one called Chandler. And you can typically find this from online sources. It's hard to know what garden centers will carry what. But Chandler is a day neutral variety. So it will actually flower and set fruit kind of anytime that temperatures aren't too cold or too hot. So I would, anticipate for you, you would be getting strawberry harvest probably February, March. You're much more similar to like Central and South Florida than what I am here, whereas my strawberries start to come in late April, May. Yeah, I think you're a couple months. So when should you cut back your fig trees? I generally recommend, yeah, January. I was going to say like when they're dormant. Um, Really interesting, sort of disturbing tip about figs, the white sap. So the good thing when they're dormant, they don't have active sap going through them, through their vascular system. But if you trim them when they're not dormant, when they're actively growing, they have this white sap. And if you get that on your skin and then the sun hits it, it will actually cause a third-degree burn. All your skin will peel off and it lasts for a really long time. And I'm telling you this because it happened to me and it took 2 years for the scars to go away. I had it on all over my arms. And I had a couple of like magazine photo shoots and they had to Photoshop my arms because of it. And I was like, oh, I think you should leave it and do it as like a public service announcement to tell people not to cut their figs down in you know, June when you're wearing sleeveless. But that's an important thing to remember. Do it with long sleeves and wash your hands, like wear gloves when you're handling that sap. So different rubus species, I have a love-hate relationship with these. They're a bit invasive, in my opinion. I only grow them in containment and they take up a lot of room. So I actually grow these in feed tanks, but the big galvanized steel feed tanks that you can find at Tractor Supply. I don't know if raspberries will even grow for you because I feel like I'm on the cusp for them growing here. But I think blackberries are one of those plants that are gonna like survive a nuclear holocaust, just like cockroaches. So you haven't been able to keep them in Houston. I have a feeling they need a little bit longer dormancy or they need more of a cold chill. And that's one of the things that Dr. Creech at Nacogdoches or at SFA in Nacogdoches, he specialized for 20 years just in cold chill requirements on plants. So I Zoomed with him yesterday and made him look at this PowerPoint, and he was like, well, you can keep it, but they might be annuals. And then blueberries, blueberries love acid. So I think you're acidic enough, but you probably need to keep adding pine bark to your soil just to make sure that it stays acidic. The good thing with East Texas that you're not alkaline, like, you get into Dallas and God, their water pH is 9. It's impossible to grow a blueberry in Dallas. But I mean, I know in Nacogdoches they have fabulous blueberries, and I did see blueberries in the Houston area. You're going to have other varieties that have different cold chill requirements, the number of hours that you have below 40 degrees. So you have a way less cold chill than me. You are some years you're at only 200 hours below 40 degrees, whereas I average between 800 and 900 hours. And that's the thing, like some of these are going to be better candidates for raised beds or containers, large containers where you can control the media that you plant in. Now I see a question about elderberries and dewberries, and I grow elderberries. I assume they grow for you. I did not include them because they're kind of more of a foraging plant rather than like a plant you cultivate. And I have never grown dewberries, so I cannot speak to those. Okay, sulfur mixed with your compost. Well, and that's exactly it. Sulfur is going to acidify your soil. So that's the thing. And I always recommend ground pine bark. Lowe's and Home Depot sell it as soil conditioner. So it's just ground aged pine bark, and it's in a white bag with orange writing. And it's really great. You can use it as a mulch, but if you're planting new blueberries, dig the hole and fill it with your soil conditioner, and it will make a world of difference. Okay, so let's get into some flowers, because I think there's a lot of really great flowers that attract beneficial insects, and a lot of these are really easy to grow, things like celosia that grow from seed. So this is, if you're not familiar with the botanical name, this is coxcomb. This is just what happens in F2 generation. So you buy those coxcombs and they're small and they have those funny shaped, flower heads that are fasciated. And then you grow the seed out from that and they actually grow as like 4 foot tall flowers and they will take over. The good thing is they're easy to pull out. So that's the thing. When a plant is invasive, part of its invasiveness is that it's difficult to eradicate, and meaning it's hard to rip out, or if you rip it out and then 5 more sprout. That's not the case with celosia. And you'll see when it germinates, it's small, and you can just rip them out. That's what I do. Just with your hands, just go through and pull them out if they're growing in areas you don't want. Controlling citrus leaf miner. That's going to be something that I'm going to consult Google on because I live in a place that's too cold for citrus, which is why I didn't include it, because I can't give you any advice on growing citrus. Okay. Like I have to grow it as a house plant. Like it goes outside for the summer, but then it's got to come inside my house for the winter. So I absolutely cannot speak to good citrus care other than that. Spraying dormant oil is one of the main recommendations for pest control on it. I don't think that dormant oil will control leaf miners though. So let's see. Leaf miner. Let me during our next break, I'll research this more. Okay, it looks like it's difficult to control. Management. Probably, I mean, one of the non-organic ways to control things like this. Okay, good. So you see neem. A non-organic control would be an imidacloprid pesticide, which is a systemic pesticide that you either water in or you use granular and the plant absorbs it. You want to be really careful about it because it will manifest the pesticide in all aspects of the plant, including in its pollen granulars, so it can impact the pollinators who come to your citrus. Worldwide, citrus leaf miners are fairly well controlled by parasitic wasps. So that would be the thing to try and create an environment where you can have the parasitic wasps living, and then they would go through, and basically what the wasps usually do is lay their eggs like in the larva of the leaf miner, and then they die. So yeah, that's about that. Okay, I'll keep on. So Asclepias, I didn't include a lot of perennial plants in here. I was kind of focusing on annuals, but I did want to give a mention of milkweeds and how important they are for pollinators, especially, monarch caterpillars. They exclusively eat the foliage of milkweeds. So include different varieties of Asclepias in your gardens. I like Asclepias tuberosa. It's sort of a slightly shorter, more versatile, very tolerant of heat, humidity, and wetness. But you see, it's a really important source for monarchs. But remember that monarchs love nectar, the butterflies themselves, and you guys are in a path, I think, for the monarch migration. So having fall and winter active flowers is really important to help sustain the monarchs, life cycle as they make their way south. I mean, you guys might even be a place where they just stay for the winter time. I've actually never visited Houston in the winter. which doesn't make sense because that would be like the most pleasant. But I always come when it's pretty warm out. Some other plants that I recommend, buckwheat and crimson clover can be direct seeded right now to give a really cool dynamic display that benefits pollinators while simultaneously fixing nitrogen in your soil, because that crimson clover is a legume. If you don't like the white buckwheat, you can grow pink buckwheat. This is really, it's so beautiful. You can find this just by Googling pink flowering buckwheat, and you'll find a whole bunch of different seed sources available online. Some other combos that I like that are annual, the Kufia and Coleus together. I showed you another variety of Kufia earlier. Here, that one is that I have outgrowing in the front, the Kufia labia. This is a great plant because not only do butterflies like it, but so do hummingbirds. And it's a nice, for you, this would probably be a perennial, to be perfectly honest. And I would love for this to be a perennial for me. Some other weird plants that help benefit the ecosystem, Gomphora carpus, or the hairy balls. This actually used to be Asclepias, but they changed the genera name. But monarchs do eat it, but this is actually a different beneficial. This is actually a moth caterpillar that will feast on this plant. I already told you I have a thing for coleus, but I really like coleus and salvias together. And I just think that the color combos are really dynamic, and they need the same requirements. So they're not a tremendous amount of effort to put together. And then of course that Salvia coccinea, that's actually a native for you. Texas has so many awesome native plants. It's hard sometimes for me to wrap my head around how many plants I depend on that are actually native to Texas. And then as a generalist, we can just say like Southeast native, even though they're not from North Carolina, they come from Texas. Another variety of salvia, Salvia farinacea, and I think this is, again, if not native, it's certainly naturalized throughout Texas. And some of the best varieties of this were actually introduced by Peckerwood, by John Ferry. So I know they do well for you, and they are definitely perennial in your region. A plant you've probably not grown is sesame, although I highly recommend it. It's super cool. It really does love heat and humidity. It is native to India. So I kind of think you could grow this through the summer, although I'd recommend seeding it at different times of year, and then you can determine when it does best. For me, I plant this direct seeding in May. It grows and flowers all summer, and I'm just now starting to harvest the sesame seeds. So that was a self-sown plant. They typically will grow, at least 6 foot tall. You can see they're multi-stem. And then each one of those seed pods up that stalk has, like 50 or 100 seeds in it. So I usually just let them up. I'll cut them down, knock them into a wheelbarrow, and just let the seeds come out of the casing. And then we can actually eat these seeds. And often what I do is just save them and share them with people for the next season. I got my seed from Monticello. It's difficult to find the seed. So you have to do some Google work. I will tell you, the sesame seed that you buy at the grocery store does not germinate, because I've tried. You're welcome to try as well. But typically that's actually been heated, so it doesn't have an active endosperm. Marigolds, where would we be without tagetes? Marigolds are so good because they're smelly and they help keep bad insects away. They keep deer and rabbits away. They provide pollen for important pollinators, and they love, as the days get shorter, they just explode into bloom. So I love to have marigolds, and I love zinnias as well. Zinnia angustifolia, another plant that's like basically native to the Mexican-Texas border. And Zinnia angustifolia is more disease resistant, and animals don't tend to like it, versus these hybrid zinnias, or like the garden zinnias. these tend to get powdery mildew pretty badly, especially in climates like yours where it's super humid and you have high night temperatures. Now let's talk about some cool season flowers, things like snapdragons. This is actually a variety called apple blossom that, unlike the traditional snapdragon, has an open face. You can find that from parkseed.com. But then you have normal snapdragons that do really well through the cooler, shorter day months. I especially use these in containers. Violas, of course, this is like deer candy. So if you have a lot of animals, I'd just go ahead and skip these altogether, but they are pretty. Maybe if you have window boxes or containers, hanging baskets, things that animals can't get to, they're a little more practical. And then a couple of interesting cool season flowers that maybe aren't that common because they have to be direct sow. You can't buy these and transplant. Things like larkspur, which is an annual species of delphinium that's poisonous. So the reason that I say that is because the deer, rabbits, groundhogs, whatever creature it is, they know to leave this alone. And your house pets do as well. Your dog is not going to go out and indulge on larkspur, so you don't have to worry about that. But they're a really great plant-based solution for animal infestations. So you want to direct seed these a bit later in the fall than now. I usually say around Black Friday, usually Thanksgiving weekend, and you just put them down in the areas that you want them to grow. They'll germinate through the winter, and in your climate, they'll probably start blooming by March. They're kind of going to have a similar cycle to like the Texas bluebonnets or even the Texas bluebells. So they're just a cool plant that is really inexpensive to grow from seed. And they have a lot of different colors. So you can plant poisonous plants alongside edibles. They do not translocate their poison. So you would have to eat the poisonous plant to have the problem. But I absolutely grow poisonous plants, things like larkspur. I literally incorporate it into my patch of wheat. And I cover it. I have kale and mustard and garlic and things mixed right into these borders. Do you put the seed down and cover with mulch? Yes, you can with larkspur. So larkspur is a larger seed, so it can get covered. You can direct sow it, you can, rake over it, you can mulch. However, if you want to mix it with poppies, you cannot do that. The poppies have to have light to germinate. They are the last thing you sow. You do not mulch over them. You do not rake over them. You let them germinate right on the surface. Otherwise, they won't germinate. Really important. When to harvest seed from hibiscus in Toronto? When it's right. So I guess the main thing is there when the seed pod turns brown. That's going to be your sign that the seed is ripe. So there won't necessarily be an exact time because if it flowered early, you probably already have ripe seed. Yeah. Nigella, another great direct seeded plant. I know this does well in Texas because I've seen it in a lot of different places, including Houston. And this actually has edible seed. I eat it a little. I mostly grow it for its flowers. And this is shorter than poppies and larkspur. Both of those are going to be like 3 to 4 foot tall. This is going to be more like 12 to 15 inches. So you can concentrate this closer to the front of a border. Now we'll jump into grains a little bit. There's a bunch of cool season grains that you've probably never thought of growing. Just consider them to be ornamental grasses that grow through the winter time. They're really easy. Then you have warm season grains. My recommendation, if you're curious about growing grains, is to not think about it from I'm going to harvest the seed to eat, but actually growing them for their ornamental quality. And yes, cut it down, put it in the fridge. Yes. Yes. Store the seeds in the refrigerator. They don't even require that, but that's the best way. That's the best place to store them. And then you can seed them out next spring. Yes. So I've learned a lot about gluten-free grains because my food allergies are leading me this direction. Now I grow a lot of things like corn and rice, sorghum, all these things. And I would recommend trying to grow some greens in containers just to try it for the first time. They're really good candidates for pots. So you just direct seed the grains. And again, you can ask Google. There's a whole bunch of places that sell seeds of things like wheat and barley, oats. I know Enchanted Gardens sells these green seeds. And then you just fill your container with soil, direct seed the grains on top. You can mulch it lightly if you want. The grains will germinate usually within 5 to 7 days. So it's really fast. You're not waiting all season long. And then they'll ultimately, grow out and flower. And you can see how they look like an ornamental grass. In this case, this is a picture of wheat that's actually blooming right now in my driveway. I planted this in August and it's blooming now. It's in a mixed pot with Swiss chard and nasturtiums and a couple of coleus. It's just an ornamental grass. Don't be freaked out by greens. They're just ornamental grasses. But I do grow greens for soil improvement because they have really deep roots, and those roots will actually scavenge nutrients from really far below the surface. Most of the greens in one annual cycle will have root systems that go 36 to 54 inches deep. So if you have poor soil, a cover crop of greens will actually act as a natural rototiller, drawing nutrients back to the surface, and it will help break up any of your difficult soils. What we do is we direct seed our greens in some of the areas where we grow them in mass. And then we mix them with larkspur because deer and rabbits love wheat. So the way we keep the deer and rabbits out is by this plant combination with the poisonous larkspur. And that's ultimately what our field of wheat looks like. This gets planted in December, and this is what it looks like in May. Because it's a cool season crop, it grows all winter long. And we do harvest just the tips, and then we actually go through the process of getting it down to the raw seed through threshing and winnowing. We grind it, and then we actually cook with this wheat. But the main reason that I grow wheat in this context is not for us to eat, but is actually for the soil improvement. And this is what we do. We have taken the heads off of these stalks, right? So there's no seed going down to the ground. And then we mow all these stalks down into place, and we allow all of that to decompose right where it was grown. Now it's an annual. It does not resprout. The roots will decompose. They do not come back. There are no invasive issues with this process. And so that's what led me to write about grains, was this idea that homeowners don't really know how to use cover crops and don't always understand crop rotations. So a little bit about cover crops. They're primarily used, number one, to slow erosion so that you keep the soil on your property. And that's a huge issue that we have in the Southeast because we get a lot of rain year round. And especially when plants aren't actively growing, all that good organic matter runs off into our water systems. You want to rotate grains and legumes together, and peanuts are a really good candidate to grow in your climate. And they're actually quite pretty. They have those little yellow pea-like flowers, and then a peg forms, and they actually create the fruit, which is called a nut, but it's not actually a nut. It's a fruit that develops in the ground, but the ability of this plant to affix nitrogen will then benefit all the crops that you plant adjacent to it. So some legume crops that I recommend, this whole list is pretty good. I would say crimson clover and faba bean and peanuts are my top three. And I know that I've seen all three do really well throughout Texas. And then some non-legume cover crops that you can either grow simultaneously or in rotation include all of these different cereals and different brassica plants like mustards and grapes and radishes. So what are some warm season veggies? So real quick, some varieties that I recommend of eggplant, Hansel and Gretel. These are really nice small fruits that are really abundant. Again, these are from the All American Selections program. Okra candlefire, that is actually the burgundy variety that's in that colander, not the green one. And candlefire is great because it stays small longer. So you have like a 2-day period to be able to harvest, whereas some of the traditional okras, you know, the fruits just get so big so fast and then they're too hard to eat. Mad Hatter pepper is a really great pepper that has a lot of high production but doesn't have the heat. So think of it as an edible habanero. So, you know, habaneros, you'll get like 1,000 fruit from one plant. But what rational adult eats habaneros on a regular basis, right? Well, breeders recognize that and they created Mad Hatter to give you the productivity of a hot pepper with the flavor of a bell pepper. Into rice. I know that Houston actually has a rice agricultural element. Again, it's a very ornamental plant. You can just consider it to be like an ornamental grass. If you have an area that's particularly wet, it will do very well there. I started growing it because I was just tired of purple fountain grass collapsing every time it rained. And I realized that rice has better structural integrity. So this will grow quite tall, very upright. You can grow it in the ground or you can grow it in containers. Now, Roselle, this is a great variety of hibiscus. If you've ever had hibiscus tea, this is actually what you're eating or what you're drinking. You're eating the calyx of the hibiscus sabdurifa. It's a beautiful plant. It does really well in your area. For me, I usually get frost like 2 days before these are ready to be harvested. So it's a little frustrating, but for you, this is a great plant. Tomatillas, 2 varieties that I recommend, both from Texas, Purple Coban and Rio Grande Verde. And of course, this is often used in salsas, especially salsa verde. Into tomatoes, I didn't do a lot with tomatoes, but the Chef's Choice series are a new variety that have better heat tolerance and a little bit better disease resistance. So I do recommend them. They are really nice slicing varieties. My all-time favorite tomato is one called cream sausage, and this is a cream to yellow colored paste tomato. So it's like Roma, except it's yellow, and it's really sweet flavored. It makes a wonderful sauce, but it's also a great slicing tomato. And this is smaller. It's a semi-determinate variety. So you could grow this in a pot. It's only going to get about 3, maybe 3.5 foot tall. And it has a long span of flowering. And it flowers fast. So from seed, you're going to get fruit usually within 70 days. Now into some cool season veggies. These are all, again, veggies that I recommend that you direct sow. You can transplant these. You can buy them from a garden center and transplant, but it's going to be more effective and less expensive to just get seed and direct sow them. And what we like to do here is make spicy edible ground covers through the winter. This helps deter rabbits and groundhogs, but it gives us a lot to be able to harvest and have salads. So what we do is we mix things like arugula because that's very bitter. We mix different varieties of mustards in, and then we add things like kale, like the dinosaur kale or the Tuscan kale or kale prism. We put all that seed together and then we direct seed it right onto compost on the ground, typically in areas of open mulch space. And then we allow it to germinate in place, and then we can come and cut through and make salads. Now, of course, all of these things can be grown in pots. So some pretty examples of these cool season leafy greens in containers. Here's the red boar kale and parsley mixed together. And we also like to do leafy greens as hanging baskets. So what we do is we fill our baskets with potting soil, and then we direct seed lettuce, leaf lettuce, not heading lettuce, but leaf lettuce into these pots. And then what we end up with are salad bowl baskets that hang on your front or back porch. Swiss chard is another great plant to incorporate for its, just for its sheer beauty, even if you don't like to eat it. It's a good candidate for in-ground and container growing. And I always recommend the addition of umbel flowers, also best direct seeded. Things like carrots and celery, cilantro, dill, all of these things do better when you don't disturb their root system, which is why direct seeding is going to be your number one option. I'm always looking for ground plane coverage because that's what eliminates my weed pressure. And that enables me to do better crop rotations with a bigger mix, a more diverse mix of plants. So here in this photo is an example of what some of that spring cover cropping looks like. Cover cropping doesn't have to be just boring vegetation plants. It can be things like poppies and larkspur, bachelor buttons, and mustards and kales and things that you mix in. The main thing is what we do is we allow all that green matter to be mowed back in place to decompose instead of ripping it out and throwing it into a compost pile. What we do after we mow, we will typically reseed for the next season and then we mulch over it. So none of the neighbors know that there's this crazy happening on the actual ground plane itself. It will look neat and tidy by the end of the session that we have when we start mowing. We reseed, we mulch, that's all one activity. Now, some cool season heading vegetables, these are things you actually do need to transplant because they take up more space. So here's an example of some broccoli that I seeded into a tray. You can see the white dust, that's the BT to keep the cabbage worms from decimating these young seedlings. And the thing is, broccoli takes up a lot of room. So you don't want to direct seed broccoli because the seeds will be too close together. So you want to transplant your heading vegetables into your garden, whereas your leafy greens can be direct seeded. And then you will have better ground plane coverage, you'll have more to harvest from, and it's less expensive. Another great example of a heading vegetable is cabbage. And here again, it's planted with sweet potatoes. And kohlrabi, if you're not familiar with kohlrabi, this should be the year you try to grow it. It's an easy plant to grow. It's easier than cabbage. Kohlrabi is just a really kind of doesn't even have that much of a taste. It's just crisp and watery, and it's really refreshing. And here are some examples of some of the vegetables that could go into containers. Certainly a variety like Ruby Perfection cabbage is a great candidate for pot culture. And then of course, mustard and Swiss chard and lettuce and mixed in with things like violas in pots that are tall enough that would at least keep the rabbits from eating them. And on the right-hand side, that's actually the purple cauliflower growing in a pot. And I have a lot of trouble growing cauliflower, but I can grow them in containers, and cauliflower tends to be a little less tolerant of wetness. So that's why elevating it in a container or a raised bed, it makes it significantly easier to grow. Now it brings me to the idea of, do you have to throw your potting soil away? And I say no, you do not. I know why potting soil companies tell you you have to, and so you buy more. It's that simple. In my opinion, unless you've had a disease or an insect problem in your container plantings, you don't need to dump all that soil out and start fresh. Now, typically you're going to be pulling the plants out, so you're going to be refreshing the top layer of soil anyway, but I don't think you actually have to discard all of that soil that you use in pots. Now, some more other plants for the cool season that need again to be direct seeded. These are root crops, so beets, again, carrots, daikon radish, parsnips, potatoes, rutabagas, turnips. I wanted to share the potato story because I think that it's a really fun activity to do with kids. You know, they're all addicted to French fries, and so why not show them where French fries come from? And what we do is we do grow potatoes both in containers and in ground, but we typically will dig a trench right along an edge and just put pieces of potatoes that started to sprout from the counter. You can buy seed potatoes, but there's nothing wrong with planting the potatoes from the grocery store. And if you're going to cut them up like this, you need to give them about 3 or 4 days to harden and form a callus. You don't want to put a freshly cut potato into wet soil. But you can just plant them in the ground. We usually do 15 to 18-inch trenches. We plant the potatoes about every 8 inches apart. So we create a pretty complete edge. And the reason that we do this is because potatoes are in the Solanaceae family and they have poisonous foliage. So that keeps the deer and the rabbits and the groundhogs from going in and eating everything else that's behind it. Now, if you want to harvest new potatoes, you're going to do that when they flower. And it's typically 60 days from when you plant. And in your climate, you can plant potatoes year round. They're not going to be actively growing through the summer. They don't like heat, but they don't die. They just go dormant. So you can literally plant potatoes anytime. They're going to grow when the temperatures are milder. Now, in our case, I don't usually harvest until the plants start to collapse, and they do that from the heat. That's the sign that it's time to harvest. And we planted that 60-foot long property border. 3 months later, we harvested 80 pounds of potatoes. Potatoes want to be stored, at room temperature in a dark area. So, a closet, a pantry, a cupboard. If you have a root cellar, that's awesome. You probably don't have root cellars. You flood too much to have areas like that. In Houston, we don't have root cellars here in Raleigh either. I would kill to have one, but that's just not a reality. Now, in Aiden's case, he was 8 when he started gardening with me. This is my neighbor, and he had never cooked potatoes before. So he was really excited to take this experience from having planted it all the way through to the stage of eating it. And he researched recipes, and he was like a peacock on our 4th of July picnic when he served these potatoes that he grew to all of our neighbors. And he, the 8-year-old, got to teach the adults how to grow potatoes. Because honestly, most of the adults didn't know. They had no idea. He was like, well, they didn't know where French fries came from. So now I don't feel so bad that I didn't know. But that's the cool thing. It's like your garden can be so much bigger than just yourself. And there's so many important lessons that can be taught through these experiences of not just growing food, but growing all plants. Now, if you want to grow them in pots, you can, and there's basically not a size limit. Like this container that I'm showing you here was really small. I thought it was absolutely silly that I was planting potatoes, but look at how many potatoes I got out of that. Again, it's about a 3-month cycle from planting to harvesting. And on the left-hand side, that's what the potato foliage looks like while it's actively growing. I do have a YouTube video to show you that, and that's part of your resource package. Okay, so do you want me to just channel through, because we're already half an hour over? Anybody mind if I just keep going instead of having a break? I'm going to take that as no. So we're going to jump into the animal part, and this is fun, and I think there's actually some really practical information here. So is it deer proof? No. And it's also not rabbit or groundhog or mole or vole or pig or armadillo or anything else, So my recommendations is to first identify who is causing the trouble. You're probably going to have different animals at different times of year. So, don't plant their favorite things. I know in Houston, you're not planting hostas, but, stay away from the things that are like literally a salad bar, which actually would literally be leafy greens. So, and then just recognize that like deer spray doesn't necessarily work on all the animals. So you have to actually find a spray that's going to work for the creatures that you have. So the example, like liquid fence, which is a very effective deterrent, it only works on deer and rabbits. So if you've got groundhogs and armadillos, this doesn't help with them. What I recommend with liquid fence is to only apply it when your plants are dormant, and then find a cheaper repellent during the growing season, because it's not absorbed in the plant's material. It's not systemic. So this is only going to be effective on the material that you've sprayed. So you don't want to be using this when your plant is actively growing a foot a week, because then you're going to have to spray it every single week. I really like the I Must Garden products, and partly because they're very inexpensive. $9.99 versus $120. It's a pretty big difference. And what's unique about these is that they're created for every different animal. So there's a squirrel repellent, there's a snake repellent, there's an armadillo repellent, and you get the repellent that is meant to deal with the creatures that you have. And in case anybody noticed, that is a shirt from Waco, because I went to Magnolia because I'm a super fan. Another nod to Texas. Now, another thing to be aware of that we lie on labels a lot of times, like especially plant labels. It's always going to be bigger than what the plant label says. I think with repellents, you've got to spray way more often than what they recommend. So I've learned to keep a small sprayer, you know, in a area that's right outside where I can grab it when I walk to my mailbox. I carry it with me and I spray as I go. And that's been one of the only ways that I can really keep up with the animals that live here. We're like right on the edge of farmland, and now all that farmland is getting developed, and we have more deer and rabbits than I've ever seen before. Now, motion censored irrigation works pretty well. What I recommend for this is not actually tying it into your irrigation system, but actually doing this with hoses, because you need to move it around. That's the only way this really works, is the element of surprise. Now these do have day and night detection, so you want to be aware of, like, when you're working in the garden or you're having friends over to visit, that you deactivate it, because it shoots a high velocity of water out, and it shocks people. Okay, like, it's very surprising. But it's, again, very inexpensive solution. You can buy this sensor, this orbit sensor, for $72.99 on Amazon. Cages, I've been in some neighborhoods with really strict HOAs, but for some reason, caging every single individual plant is allowed, but they're not allowed to grow vegetables. It doesn't make sense, because this doesn't look pretty. Like, that hibiscus is straight up in jail. There's no other way around it. Now, it's not getting eaten. I will give them that, but it doesn't look good. But we do use cattle fence panels to sort of to edge our beds. And they're an inexpensive, easy to use solution. It's galvanized steel, so it doesn't rust. They're easy to bend. I actually use these for cages, for like tomato cages and stuff as well. And I've included a link to show you how we do it. It's actually Aiden, who's now 13, giving you instructions on how to create a fence that will keep, like, dogs from going into your bed. It also works on other animals. Aiden just happens to have dogs that are like the size of small deer. Now, some foodscaping solutions for animals. And here's Aiden again. He was the one that came up with the idea of just planting bed edges. He was watching deer and rabbits maneuver through the garden, and he said, well, when they come up to the edge and they don't like it, they seem to trot off and they go into someone else's yard. And we really ran with that strategy, and it's worked. I have great examples in my garden right now where I have these plants along an edge and I have no deer browse, and in a bed adjacent where I don't have these plants in, they've eaten everything. So some herb solutions. Basil is especially good as an edge. I particularly like the globe basil because it's smaller, it's very tight. This is not the kind of basil that you necessarily want to be making pesto from. In my opinion, it tastes like burning hair. And I actually have a small video to play for you here.
I don't really like the way it tastes, but I do love how it looks in the landscape.
So you see, it kind of looks like a boxwood, but it's cheap. So that's the advantage. And Mycrete is just a variety of globe basil. Oops, there we go. Some other varieties of basil that I recommend. This is all because of their downy mildew resistance. And downy mildew is a huge problem with Genovese basil. So I recommend trying to find these varieties instead so you don't have disease issues. Amazel, which is the one from Proven Winners right here. Everleaf Emerald Towers, which I will tell you I have growing, and it has not flowered yet. You know, basil gets really bitter once it starts flowering. Everleaf Emerald Towers has been planted in my garden since May, and it has not initiated flowers. So that is a really, really exceptional workhorse disease-resistant variety. And then, of course, the bottom right, the spicy globe basil, which is available through the Bonnie's program at Home Depot. Other herbs that you can grow, again, along edges to deter animals include things like oregano and thyme. These are probably not perennial for you. They're barely perennial for me, but it's fine to grow them as annuals. Same thing, rosemary. Rosemary has such a strong scent. Human beings are the only thing that like the flavor of rosemary. So if you have like a property border where you want to block deer from coming, plant rosemary. Garlic and onions are really great, and I think they're very practical, but they help deter voles underground, but then they also deter above ground animals. Usually with onions, you're going to buy sets. And they're usually just kind of sets. They're either red onions, yellow onions, or white onions. You can also get the Egyptian walking onion, which is what's photographed here. But if you really want to do something that I think is meaningful, and I promise this is the end, I want to encourage you to grow garlic. And I have some varieties specifically for you. Well, for me too, but especially for you, because a lot of the varieties aren't going to do well in Houston. So these are the ones that I would focus on. I would particularly say the Creole varieties are extremely heat tolerant. They do very well. These I've seen growing in Mobile and New Orleans. I have seen these throughout Texas. So, you know, these are some of the very best varieties. And you can, again, Google this to find a source if you don't have a local garden center supplying these. There's some porcelain varieties that I like to grow. One of my favorites is this one here, Music. And that's what's photographed here. Music is a nice one because it's a large clove hardneck variety. Again, hardnecks do better in the South than softnecks. And when you plant them, it's really easy. You just thumb them into the bed edge for the purpose of animal deterring. Don't take the paper off. You get a clove, and you have a bulb, and you're going to peel the cloves off, and you're going to plant each clove individually. Each clove will turn into a bulb by the end of its growing season. All parts of garlic are edible. The advantage of foliage and flowerscapes is that they don't have the same enzyme as the bulb. So for people who have a digestive issue with garlic but like the flavor, you can eat the leaves and the flowerscapes. And you do need to remove the flowerscape because you need the plant's energy to go back into bulb production, not into flowering and seeding. So this is mostly with hardneck varieties. In the South, you're primarily going to be growing hardneck varieties. So you will have a flowerscape, you just break it off. I put my flowerscapes right into the food processor, and I grind them up with some onions and some olive oil, some salt and pepper. And I'll often just freeze this concoction and then add it to sauces and salsas and soups, chilies year round. I just freeze it in quart-sized bags. The cool thing is you don't need a lot of room to grow a lot of garlic. So literally a 12-foot bed edge could produce 6 months worth of garlic if you ate just a few cloves a day. So just like the potatoes, the sign that it's time to harvest is when the foliage starts to die back and get ugly. And, you know, you just walk around and pull it out. And What you want to do is cure the bulbs by hanging them in an area with good airflow that's out of direct sunlight. So if you don't have a covered porch, you can put it in a garage or a shed and add a box fan, because I know Houston is too humid to cure garlic without the addition of extra airflow. But the reason you cure the garlic is to maintain its shelf life, and that's really important. You can eat it fresh, but if you grow enough garlic to be able to eat throughout the year, you're going to want it to be cured. So then you can stash it inside in a pantry. I actually just use mesh bags that I had gotten from a farmer's market, and I hang it inside my pantry so that I have access to garlic any time of the year. Now, the main reason that I want to encourage you to grow garlic is to think about food miles. And in the case of garlic, since 2012, 90% of the garlic sold in American grocery stores is being imported from China. And that's an awfully far distance for a product that all of our sunny landscapes could be producing. So this is a really easy plant to grow for yourself. It grows through the cool season. It does not need irrigation. It does not need supplemental fertilizer, and it simultaneously keeps animals from eating other plants in your garden. So any number of those reasons is a justification to try growing it. The fact that you get to harvest it and cook with it is an actual bonus. So I hope you'll see every landscape offers an opportunity to grow food. I want to just share a nice feel-good story. When the pandemic hit, the neighbor kids said, well, let's start growing food in other people's yards. And actually, Abby right there, she's standing in front of one of our homemade cattle fence things that's along the front of a bed to keep the dogs and the rabbits out. So they started, with the owner's permission, installing foodscapes throughout our neighborhood when school, was suddenly shut down, and started interviewing the neighbors, asking what their favorite food was, evaluating their properties, seeing where they had in their landscape that could accommodate the inclusion of vegetables. And my good friend and colleague, Joe Lample, got word of this, and he came up in June to shoot an episode all about their efforts in growing food with their neighbors and creating a sense of community through the act of gardening. And so you can watch that anytime on growingagreenerworldtv.com, or you can go to the website and type in your zip code, and you can find out when Growing a Greener World airs on your local PBS channel. It is nationally syndicated, so you can watch it live on PBS, but you can also watch it straight from the website. So I thank you for your time, especially since you gave me an extra 45 minutes. You can visit my website, and you can sign up for my newsletter there. That's on the bottom of my homepage if you want to keep in touch, or you can visit me at any of these social media places. I'm pretty good about checking them because I think I'm addicted to my phone. And I would love to answer any more questions. I saw a question about the brick labels, and I was so excited to see that. So the brick labels are awesome because they don't fly away in the wind. They don't float away in a flood. And you just paint over them. And then I use this marker called garden marker. That's literally what it's called, garden marker. And it lasts for like years out in the sunshine. Not Sharpie. Do not use Sharpies. They like fade in like 20 days. But you use the garden marker on a painted brick, and then season after season, you can just replant it and relabel. And then you don't have any plastic labels out in your landscape. So yeah, that's a great way to use bricks. It's something that I'm really proud of myself for having come up with. But then I realized, like, people paint rocks and use those as labels. So this really isn't that different. Oh, I really appreciate you all hanging in. I really thought that I would do this in a more timely fashion. So I apologize for absorbing like half of your Saturday, but this has been a treat. I hope it's useful. So definitely keep in touch and send me updates, and when I
Brie,
can fly
this
again,
was
I'm gonna come.
fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate all the extra time. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I know you learned so much. So start planting.
That's right. There's no time like the present.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
All right, and now I'm gonna save the chat.
Okay.
Oh, and I see someone said you mentioned links. And I am gonna say yes, links.
We just appreciate you so much for doing this for us.
Oh my gosh, well, this was a pleasure. I feel terrible that it went over so long, but I'm glad that people were game for sticking with it.
You you were speaking to lots of master gardeners and they love this.
Oh, good. I love master gardeners so much. I'm so grateful that they exist.
I love knowing that you grew up in 4-H. So did I.
Oh, isn't it such a great program?
It
I
is.
hate that North Carolina doesn't really have it, but now we do have junior master gardeners. And it's not the same as 4-H, but it's pretty cool. We always have the junior master gardeners visit, and I like make them work.
That's great. Yes, we do junior master gardening here too. We have a huge program.
Oh, that's awesome.
Hi, Bree. Just a quick question.
Yeah.
I spent a whole day putting miracle growth to my topsoil to my trees and shrubs. Um, will it cause long-term damage to them?
It shouldn't cause long-term damage. Well, it shouldn't. I mean, it's not going to make them die. What it's going to do is just suppress, like, you know, in your stomach when you're not digesting well and you take a probiotic and then like things start working again. It's kind of the same thing in the soil where you put down that synthetic and then you don't have any microbial activity. So then you're basically addicted to the synthetic because the plant doesn't have any way to naturally absorb nutrients.
Oh,
Because the only way plants absorb nutrients is actually through the symbiotic relationship of microbes in the soil. Otherwise, it's having to come from a chemical application of NPK. So my recommendation is like you don't need to get rid of it, but don't do it anymore. And then just buy like black cow is a decent compost. If you can find something that's more local, you're always better because local ingredients are going to be like what you really need for your soil improvement. And I would just say, and stay away from anything that has embedded fertilizer. That's fine, like in the container industry where we grow pots in the nursery industry and we irrigate every day. That's the only way to keep them fertilized. But in the ground, you don't need that. So you're actually paying for something you don't need, which is really what makes me mad about the Scott's products, specifically the Miracle Grow. It's like 90% of what's in Miracle Grow, your plants don't actually absorb. So it's kind of a pointless fertilizer.
I see. So miracle growth is for indoor, not outdoor.
Yes, indoor or containers. Yes. Yes. Now they've tried to brand themselves for in-ground gardening, but it's not, they're not that good. They're just not the best products. Obviously, Scott's is never ever going to be a sponsor of mine because I'm relatively critical of the products they sell, but it's because I've used them and failed. And I've learned that the reason I failed is because sometimes their soil holds too much water and then you get root rot, or that you're over fertilizing your plants and then they grow too vigorously and then they die back when you get cold. And, you know, there's just like a whole slew of things that kind of set the consumer up to fail so that you buy their product over and over again. And from a real gardening perspective, that is not appropriate or necessary.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.
I enjoyed very much.